Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was an English writer, philosopher, and advocate of women's rights. Until the late 20th century, Wollstonecraft's life, which encompassed several unconventional personal relationships, received more attention than her writing. Today Wollstonecraft is regarded as one of the founding feminist philosophers, and feminists often cite both her life and work as important influences. During her brief career, she wrote novels, treatises, a travel narrative, a history of the French Revolution, a conduct book, and a children's book. Wollstonecraft is best known for A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in which she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. She suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded on reason. After Wollstonecraft's death, her widower published a memoir of her life, revealing her unorthodox lifestyle, which inadvertently destroyed her reputation for almost a century. However, with the emergence of the feminist movement at the turn of the 20th century, Wollstonecraft's advocacy of women's equality and critiques of conventional femininity became increasingly important. After two ill-fated affairs, with Henry Fuseli and Gilbert Imlay, Wollstonecraft married the philosopher William Godwin, one of the forefathers of the anarchist movement. Wollstonecraft died at the age of 38, 11 days after giving birth to her second daughter, leaving behind several unfinished manuscripts. This daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, became an accomplished writer herself, as Mary Shelley, whose best-known work was Frankenstein. Wollstonecraft was born on April 27, 1759 in Spitalfields, London. She was the second of the 7 children of Elizabeth Dixon and Edward John Wollstonecraft. Although her family had a comfortable income when she was a child, her father gradually squandered it on speculative projects. Consequently, the family became financially unstable and they were frequently forced to move during Wollstonecraft's youth. The family's financial situation eventually became so dire that Wollstonecraft's father compelled her to turn over money that she would have inherited at her maturity. Moreover, he was apparently a violent man who would beat his wife in drunken rages. As a teenager, Wollstonecraft used to lie outside the door of her mother's bedroom to protect her. Wollstonecraft played a similar maternal role for her sisters, Everina and Eliza, throughout her life. For example, in a defining moment in 1784, she convinced Eliza, who was suffering from what was probably postpartum depression, to leave her husband and infant. Wollstonecraft made all of the arrangements for Eliza to flee, demonstrating her willingness to challenge social norms. The human costs, however, were severe. Her sister suffered social condemnation and, because she could not remarry, was doomed to a life of poverty and hard work. 2 friendships shaped Wollstonecraft's early life. The first was with Jane Arden in Beverly. The two frequently read books together and attended lectures presented by Arden's father, a self-styled philosopher and scientist. Wollstonecraft reveled in the intellectual atmosphere of the Arden household and valued her friendship with Arden greatly, sometimes to the point of being emotionally possessive. Wollstonecraft wrote to her, "I have formed romantic notions of friendship. I am a little singular in my thoughts of love and friendship. I must have the first place or none." In some of Wollstonecraft's letters to Arden, she reveals the volatile and depressive emotions that would haunt her throughout her life. The second and more important friendship was with Fanny Blood, introduced to Wollstonecraft by the Clares, a couple in Hoxton who became parental figures to her. Wollstonecraft credited Blood with opening her mind. Unhappy with her home life, Wollstonecraft struck out on her own in 1778 and accepted a job as a lady's companion to Sarah Dawson, a widow living in Bath. However, Wollstonecraft had trouble getting along with the irascible woman. In 1780 she returned home, called back to care for her dying mother. Rather than return to Dawson's employ after the death of her mother, Wollstonecraft moved in with the Bloods. She realized during the 2 years she spent with the family that she had idealized Blood, who was more invested in traditional feminine values than was Wollstonecraft. But Wollstonecraft remained dedicated to her and her family throughout her life. Wollstonecraft had envisioned living in a female utopia with blood. They made plans to rent rooms together and support each other emotionally and financially, but this dream collapsed under economic realities. In order to make a living, Wollstonecraft, her sisters, and Blood set up a school together in Newington Green, a dissenting community. Blood soon became engaged, and after their marriage her husband, Hugh Skeys, took her to Lisbon, Portugal, to improve her health, which had always been precarious. Despite the change of surroundings, Blood's health further deteriorated when she became pregnant, and in 1785 Wollstonecraft left the school and followed Blood to nurse her, but to no avail. Moreover, her abandonment of the school led to its failure. Blood's death devastated Wollstonecraft and was part of the inspiration for her first novel, Mary, a fiction. After Blood's death, Wollstonecraft's friends helped her obtain a position as governess to the daughters of the Anglo-Irish Kingsborough family in Ireland. Although she could not get along with Lady Kingsborough, the children found her an inspiring instructor. Margaret King would later say she had freed her mind from all superstitions. Some of Wollstonecraft's experiences during this year would make their way into her only children's book, Original Stories from Real Life. Frustrated by the limited career options open to respectable yet poor women, an impediment which Wollstonecraft eloquently describes in the chapter of Thoughts on the Education of Daughters entitled Unfortunate Situation of Females, Fashionably Educated, and Left Without a Fortune, she decided, after only a year as a governess, to embark upon a career as an author. This was a radical choice, since, at the time, few women could support themselves by writing. As she wrote to her sister Everina in 1787, she was trying to become the first of a new genus. She moved to London and, assisted by the liberal publisher Joseph Johnson, found a place to live and work to support herself. She learned French and German and translated texts, most notably of the importance of religious opinions by Jacques Necker and Elements of Morality, for the use of children by Christian Gotthilf Salzmann. She also wrote reviews, primarily of novels, for Johnson's periodical, The Analytical Review. Wollstonecraft's intellectual universe expanded during this time, not only from the reading that she did for her reviews but also from the company she kept. She attended Johnson's famous dinners and met such luminaries as the radical pamphleteer Thomas Paine and the philosopher William Godwin. The first time Godwin and Wollstonecraft met, they were disappointed in each other. Godwin had come to hear Paine, but Wollstonecraft assailed him all night long, disagreeing with him on nearly every subject. Johnson himself, however, became much more than a friend. She described him in her letters as a father and a brother. While in London, Wollstonecraft pursued a relationship with the artist Henry Fuseli, even though he was already married. She was, she wrote, enraptured by his genius, the grandeur of his soul, that quickness of comprehension, and lovely sympathy. She proposed a platonic living arrangement with Fuseli and his wife, but Fuseli's wife was appalled, and he broke off the relationship with Wollstonecraft. After Fuseli's rejection, Wollstonecraft decided to travel to France to escape the humiliation of the incident, and to participate in the revolutionary events that she had just celebrated in her recent vindication of the rights of men. She had written The Rights of Men in response to the Whig MP Edmund Burke's conservative critique of the French Revolution in Reflections on the Revolution in France, and it made her famous overnight. Reflections on the Revolution in France was published on November 1, 1790, and so angered Wollstonecraft that she spent the rest of the month writing her rebuttal. A Vindication of the Rights of Men, in a letter to the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, was published on November 29, 1790, initially anonymously. The second edition of A Vindication of the Rights of Men was published on December 18, and this time the publisher revealed Wollstonecraft as the author. Wollstonecraft called the French Revolution a glorious chance to obtain more virtue and happiness than hitherto blessed our globe. Against Burke's dismissal of the Third Estate as men of no account, Wollstonecraft wrote, "Time many show, that this obscure throng knew more of the human heart and of legislation than the profligates of rank, emasculated by hereditary effeminacy." About the events of 5-6 October 1789, when the royal family was marched from Versailles to Paris by a group of angry housewives, Burke praised Queen Marie Antoinette as a symbol of the refined elegance of the Ancien Regime, who was surrounded by furies from hell, in the abused shape of the vilest of women. Wollstonecraft by contrast wrote of the same event, "Probably you mean women who gained a livelihood by selling vegetables or fish, who never had any advantages of education." Wollstonecraft was compared with such leading lights as the theologian and controversialist Joseph Priestley and Paine, whose Rights of Man would prove to be the most popular of the responses to Burke. She pursued the ideas she had outlined in Rights of Men in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her most famous and influential work. Wollstonecraft's fame extended across the English Channel, for when the French statesman Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord visited London in 1792, he visited her, during which she asked that French girls be given the same right to an education that French boys were being offered by the new regime in France. Wollstonecraft left for Paris in December 1792 and arrived about a month before Louis XVI was guillotined. Britain and France were on the brink of war when she left for Paris, and many advised her not to go. France was in turmoil. She sought out other British visitors such as Helen Maria Williams and joined the circle of expatriates then in the city. On December 26, 1792, Wollstonecraft saw the former king, Louis XVI, being taken to be tried before the National Assembly, and much to her own surprise, found the sight of Louis riding down the streets as a prisoner in a wagon made the tears flow insensibly from my eyes, when I saw Louis sitting, with more dignity than I expected from his character, in a hackney coach going to meet death, where so many of his race have triumphed. During her time in Paris, Wollstonecraft associated mostly with the moderate Girondins rather than the more radical Jacobins. In February 1793, France declared war on Britain, and Wollstonecraft attempted to leave France for Switzerland, but was declined permission. In March 1793, the Jacobin-dominated Committee of Public Safety came to power in France, instituting a totalitarian regime meant to mobilize France for the First Total War, and life became very difficult for foreigners in France. All foreigners living in France were put under police surveillance, had to produce 6 written statements from Frenchmen testifying to their loyalty to the Republic in order to be granted residency permits, and on April 12, 1793 all foreigners were forbidden to leave France. Despite her sympathy for the revolution, life for Wollstonecraft became very uncomfortable, all the more so as the Girondins had lost out to the Jacobins. Some of Wollstonecraft's French friends lost their heads to the guillotine as the Jacobins set out to annihilate all of their enemies. Having just written The Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft was determined to put her ideas to the test, and in the stimulating intellectual atmosphere of the French Revolution she attempted her most experimental romantic attachment yet. She met and fell passionately in love with Gilbert Imlay, an American adventurer. Wollstonecraft put her own principles in practice by sleeping with Imlay despite not being married, which was not something that was considered acceptable behavior from a respectable British woman at the time. Whether or not she was interested in marriage, he was not, and she appears to have fallen in love with an idealized portrait of the man. While Wollstonecraft had rejected the sexual component of relationships in The Rights of Woman, Imlay awakened her passions and her interest in sex. Wollstonecraft was to a certain extent disillusioned by what she saw in France, writing that the people under the Republic were still behaved slavishly to those who held power while the government remained venal and brutal. Despite her disenchantment, Wollstonecraft wrote, "I cannot yet give up the hope that a fairer day is dawning on Europe, though I must hesitatingly observe that little is to be expected from the narrow principle of commerce, which seems everywhere to be shoving aside the principle of honor of the noblesse. For the same pride of office, the same desire of power are still visible, with this aggravation, that, fearing to return to obscurity, after having but just acquired a relish for distinction, each hero or philosopher, for all are dubbed with these new titles, endeavors to make hay while the sun shines." Wollstonecraft was offended by the way that the Jacobins refused to grant French women equal rights, denounced Amazons, and made it clear the role of women was to conform to Rousseau's ideal of as a helper to men. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was guillotined with one of the charges that she'd been convicted of being she had committed incest with her son. Though Wollstonecraft disliked the former queen, she was troubled by the way that the Jacobins had made Marie Antoinette's alleged perverted sexuality that had caused her to engage in an incestuous relationship with the Dauphin one of the central reasons for why the French people should hate her. On October 31, 1793, most of the Girondin leaders were guillotined, which caused Wollstonecraft to faint when Imlay broke the news to her. To protect Wollstonecraft, Imlay registered her as his wife in 1793, even though they were not married. After declaring war on Britain, France was blockaded by the Royal Navy, which caused shortages that worsened the problem of inflation. Imlay engaged in blockade running, chartering ships to bring in food and soap from America into France, which explained why both he and Wollstonecraft were not arrested during the Reign of Terror. As the Terror began in France with arrests and executions occurring daily, Wollstonecraft came under suspicion as someone from a nation that was at war with France and who was known to be a friend of leading Girondins, which led Imlay to make a false statement to the U.S. Embassy in Paris that he had married her, automatically making her into an American citizen, in order to protect her from arrest. Some of her friends were not so lucky, many, like Thomas Paine, were arrested, and some were even guillotined. Wollstonecraft called life under the Jacobins nightmarish with gigantic parades in the day where everyone had to cheer, lest they fall under suspicion of not being committed to the Republic, and police raids at night to arrest enemies of the Republic. In a letter to her sister Everina, written in March 1794, Wollstonecraft wrote, "It is impossible for you to have any idea of the impression the sad scenes I have been a witness to have left on my mind. Death and misery, in every shape of terror, haunts this devoted country. I certainly am glad that I came to France, because I never could have had else a just opinion of the most extraordinary event that has ever been recorded." Wollstonecraft soon became pregnant by Imlay, and on May 14, 1794 she gave birth to her first child, Fanny, naming her after perhaps her closest friend. Wollstonecraft was overjoyed. She wrote to a friend, "My little girl begins to suck so manfully that her father reckons saucily on her writing the second part of the RTS of Woman." She continued to write avidly, despite not only her pregnancy and the burdens of being a new mother alone in a foreign country, but also the growing tumult of the French Revolution. While at Le Havre in northern France, she wrote a history of the early Revolution, an historical and moral view of the French Revolution, which was published in London in December 1794. Imlay, unhappy with the domestic-minded and maternal Wollstonecraft, eventually left her. He promised that he would return to Le Havre where she went to give birth to her child, but his delays in writing to her and his long absences convinced Wollstonecraft that he had found another woman. Her letters to him are full of needy expostulations, explained by most critics as the expressions of a deeply depressed woman but by some as a result of her circumstances alone with an infant in the middle of a revolution. In July 1794, Wollstonecraft welcomed the fall of the Jacobins, predicting this would be followed with a restoration of freedom of press in France, which led her to return to Paris. In August 1794, Imlay departed for London and promised to return soon. The winter of 1794-95 was the coldest winter in Europe for over a century, which reduced Wollstonecraft and her daughter Fanny down to desperate circumstances. The River Seine froze that winter, which made it impossible for ships to bring food and coal to Paris, leading to widespread starvation and deaths from the cold in that city. Wollstonecraft continued to write to Imlay, asking him to return to France at once, declaring she still had faith in the revolution and did not wish to return to Britain. In 1793, the British government began a crackdown on radicals, suspending civil liberties, imposing drastic censorship, and trying for treason all suspected of sympathy with the revolution, which led Wollstonecraft to fear she would be imprisoned if she returned. After she left France on April 7, 1795, she continued to refer to herself as Mrs. Imlay, even to her sisters, in order to bestow legitimacy upon her child. The British historian Tom Furness called an historical and moral view of the French Revolution the most neglected of Wollstonecraft's books, which was first published in London in 1794, and a second edition did not appear until 1989. The reason for this neglect is later generations were more interested in her feminist writings rather her account of the French Revolution, which Furness regretted as he called an historical and moral view of the French Revolution easily Wollstonecraft's best work. Wollstonecraft was not trained as a historian, but she used all sorts of journals, letters, and documents recounting how ordinary people in France reacted to the revolution, and attempted to counteract what Furness called the hysterical anti-revolutionary mood in Britain, which depicted the revolution as due to the entire French nation apparently all going mad. Wollstonecraft argued that the revolution was not due to the French people all going insane in 1789 as popular opinion in Britain held, but was due to a set of social, economic, and political conditions that left no other way out of the crisis that gripped France in 1789. An historical and moral view of the French Revolution presented a difficult balancing act for Wollstonecraft as she condemned the Jacobin regime and the Reign of Terror, but at the same time, she continued to argue that revolution was a great achievement, which led her to stop her history in late 1789 rather than write about the terror of 1793–94. Burke had ended the reflections with reference to the events of 5–6 October 1789, when a group of women from Paris forced the French royal family from the Palace of Versailles to Paris. Burke called the women furies from hell while Wollstonecraft called the women just merely ordinary housewives angry about a lack of bread to feed their families. Against Burke's idealized portrait of Marie Antoinette as a noble victim of a mob, Wollstonecraft portrayed the queen as a femme fatale, a seductive, scheming and dangerous woman. Wollstonecraft argued that the values of the aristocracy were corrupting ones for women since in a monarchy, the main purpose of a woman was to bear sons to continue the house, which essentially reduced a woman's value down to her womb. Moreover, Wollstonecraft argued unless a queen was a queen regnant, most queens were queen consorts, which meant a woman to exercise influence via her husband or son, which encouraged manipulative behavior. Wollstonecraft argued that aristocratic values by emphasizing the value of a woman's body and her ability to be charming over the value of her mind and character had encouraged women like Marie Antoinette to be manipulative and ruthless, making the queen into a corrupted and corrupting product of the Ancien regime. Seeking Imlay, Wollstonecraft returned to London in April 1795, but he rejected her. In May 1795 she attempted to commit suicide, probably with laudanum, but Imlay saved her life. In a last attempt to win back Imlay, she embarked upon some business negotiations for him in Scandinavia, trying to recoup some of his losses. Wollstonecraft undertook this hazardous trip with only her young daughter and a maid. She recounted her travels and thoughts in letters to Imlay, many of which were eventually published as letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in 1796. When she returned to England and came to the full realization that her relationship with Imlay was over, she attempted suicide for the second time, leaving a note for Imlay. "Let my wrongs sleep with me. Soon, very soon, shall I be at peace. When you receive this, my burning head will be cold. I shall plunge into the Thames where there is the least chance of my being snatched from the death I seek. God bless you. May you never know by experience what you have made me endure. Should your sensibility ever awake, remorse will find its way to your heart, and, in the midst of business and sensual pleasure, I shall appear before you, the victim of your deviation from rectitude." She then went out on a rainy night and to make her clothes heavy with water, she walked up and down about half an hour before jumping into the River Thames, but a stranger saw her jump and rescued her. Wollstonecraft considered her suicide attempt deeply rational, writing after her rescue, "I have only to lament, that, when the bitterness of death was past, I was inhumanly brought back to life and misery. But a fixed determination is not to be baffled by disappointment, nor will I allow that to be a frantic attempt, which was one of the calmest acts of reason. In this respect, I am only accountable to myself. Did I care for what is termed reputation, it is by other circumstances that I should be dishonored." Gradually, Wollstonecraft returned to her literary life, becoming involved with Joseph Johnson's circle again, in particular with Mary Hayes, Elizabeth Inchbald, and Sarah Siddons through William Godwin. Godwin and Wollstonecraft's unique courtship began slowly, but it eventually became a passionate love affair. Godwin had read her letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and later wrote that if ever there was a book calculated to make a man in love with its author, this appears to me to be the book. She speaks of her sorrows, in a way that fills us with melancholy, and dissolves us in tenderness, at the same time that she displays a genius which commands all our admiration. Once Wollstonecraft became pregnant, they decided to marry so that their child would be legitimate. Their marriage revealed the fact that Wollstonecraft had never been married to Imlay, and as a result she and Godwin lost many friends. Godwin received further criticism because he had advocated the abolition of marriage in his philosophical treatise Political Justice. After their marriage on March 29, 1797, Godwin and Wollstonecraft moved to 29 The Polygon, Somers Town. Godwin rented an apartment 20 doors away at 17 Evesham Buildings in Charlton Street as a study, so that they could both still retain their independence. They often communicated by letter. By all accounts, theirs was a happy and stable, though brief, relationship. On August 30, 1797, Wollstonecraft gave birth to her second daughter, Mary. Although the delivery seemed to go well initially, the placenta broke apart during the birth and became infected. Childbed fever was a common and often fatal occurrence in the 18th century. After several days of agony, Wollstonecraft died of septicemia on September 10. Godwin was devastated. He wrote to his friend Thomas Holcroft, "I firmly believe there does not exist her equal in the world. I know from experience we were formed to make each other happy. I have not the least expectation that I can now ever know happiness again." She was buried at Old St. Pancras Churchyard, where her tombstone reads, "Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, born April 27, 1759, died September 10, 1797. Her monument in the churchyard lies to the northeast of the church, just north of Sir John Soane's grave. Her husband was buried with her on his death in 1836, as was his second wife, Mary Jane Godwin. In January 1798 Godwin published his memoirs of the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Although Godwin felt that he was portraying his wife with love, compassion, and sincerity, many readers were shocked that he would reveal Wollstonecraft's illegitimate children, love affairs, and suicide attempts. The Romantic poet Robert Southey accused him of the want of all feeling in stripping his dead wife naked, and vicious satires such as The Unsexed Females were published. Godwin's memoirs portrays Wollstonecraft as a woman deeply invested in feeling who was balanced by his reason and as more of a religious skeptic than her own writings suggest. Godwin's views of Wollstonecraft were perpetuated throughout the 19th century and resulted in poems such as Wollstonecraft and Fuseli by British poet Robert Browning and That by William Roscoe, which includes the lines, "Hard was thy fate in all the scenes of life, as daughter, sister, mother, friend, and wife. But harder still, thy fate in death we own. Thus mourned he by Godwin with a heart of stone." Wollstonecraft has what scholar Cora Kaplan labeled in 2002 a curious legacy that has evolved over time. For an author-activist adept in many genres, up until the last quarter-century Wollstonecraft's life has been read much more closely than her writing. After the devastating effect of Godwin's memoirs, Wollstonecraft's reputation lay in tatters for nearly a century. She was pilloried by such writers as Maria Edgeworth, who patterned the freakish Harriet Freke in Belinda after her. Other novelists such as Mary Hayes, Charlotte Turner Smith, Fanny Burney, and Jane West created similar figures, all to teach a moral lesson to their readers. In contrast, there was one writer of the generation after Wollstonecraft who apparently did not share the judgmental views of her contemporaries. Jane Austen never mentioned the earlier woman by name, but several of her novels contain positive allusions to Wollstonecraft's work. The American literary scholar N. K. Mellor notes several examples. In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Wickham seems to be based upon the sort of man Wollstonecraft claimed that standing armies produce, while the sarcastic remarks of protagonist Elizabeth Bennet about female accomplishments closely echo Wollstonecraft's condemnation of these activities. The balance a woman must strike between feelings and reason in Sense and Sensibility follows what Wollstonecraft recommended in her novel Mary, while the moral equivalence Austen drew in Mansfield Park between slavery and the treatment of women in British society tracks one of Wollstonecraft's favourite arguments. In Persuasion, Austen's characterization of Anne Eliot as better qualified than her father to manage the family estate also echoes a Wollstonecraft thesis. Scholar Virginia Sapiro states that few read Wollstonecraft's works during the 19th century, as her attackers implied or stated that no self-respecting woman would read her work. If readers were few, then many were inspired. One such reader was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who read Rights of Woman at age 12 and whose poem Aurora Leigh reflected Wollstonecraft's unwavering focus on education. Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Americans who met in 1840 at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, discovered they both had read Wollstonecraft, and they agreed upon the need for the Seneca Falls Convention, an influential women's rights meeting held in 1848. Another woman who read Wollstonecraft was George Eliot, a prolific writer of reviews, articles, novels, and translations. In 1855, she devoted an essay to the roles and rights of women, comparing Wollstonecraft and Margaret Fuller. Fuller was an American journalist, critic, and women's rights activist who, like Wollstonecraft, had traveled to the continent and had been involved in the struggle for reform, and she had a child by a man without marrying him. Wollstone.